The ink was a cold, black fact on the page. It was the only thing in the drafty study at Ravenshaw that felt certain. Clara Ashton traced the column of figures with a finger that was permanently smudged, a faint gray ghost of her work that no amount of lye soap could fully scrub away. The numbers told a story of slow collapse, of an ancient estate, bleeding money like a wound that would not staunch. Each entry was a drop of life, leaving the great stone house that clung to the cliffs, a house that had forgotten the meaning of warmth. This was her penance and her purpose. She was the daughter of the late steward, a man who had died in disgrace, his name synonymous with the very debts she now spent her nights trying to unravel. After his death, the Duke had allowed her to stay, not out of kindness, not truly. It was the indifferent mercy one might show a stray, allowing it shelter in a barn but never entry into the house. She was given a small cold room, her meals with the upper servants, and the unspoken expectation that she would make herself useful. And so she had. She had become the governess to the Duke's silent son, Arthur, a boy lost in a grief as vast and gray as the sea below their windows. She had become the unofficial secretary, her neat, clear hand filling the pages of letters the Duke could no longer bring himself to write. And in the secret hours of the night, when the house was settled into its chilled slumber, she became what her father had been, the keeper of the books. She did it without being asked, without title or pay. She did it because the chaos of the ledgers was a puzzle she could solve, unlike the puzzle of her own life. It was a way to restore the honor her father had lost, even if no one but her would ever know it. A sharp rap at the study door made her flinch. Before she could answer, it swung open, letting in a gust of colder air, and a woman who seemed to generate a frost of her own. Lady Honoria Vane, the Duke's aunt, stood silhouetted in the doorway, her gaze sweeping the room with an expression of profound distaste. Still at it. "I see," Lady Honoria said, her voice thin and sharp. She glided into the room, her silk skirts rustling like dry leaves. Her eyes, the color of pale winter sky, landed on Clara's ink-stained fingers. "A clerk's work, I suppose it is what one must expect." "Is my nephew-in-law, his grace, is with Master Arthur?" Clara replied, her voice quiet and even. She had learned long ago that the best defense against Lady Honoria was a profound and unshakable calm. It gave the woman's cruelty nothing to purchase on. Lady Honoria's lips thinned, with the boy, and leaving the business of this crumbling mausoleum to you. The pause was a small, deliberate cruelty. She let her gaze drift over the peeling gilt on a book spine, the faint film of dust on the mantelpiece that the overworked housemaids had missed. A Ravenshaw is not what it was. My dear niece, the late Duchess, would be heartbroken to see it so. The fires unlit, the Chielida silent, and the master of the house locked away with his grief. She took a step closer, her scent of lavender and disapproval filling the small space around the desk. "Tell me, Miss Ashton, as you seem to have your nose so deep in my nephew's affairs, is the situation as dire as the whispers in London suggest?" Clara did not look up from the ledger. She had spent the last week tracing a discrepancy, a series of payments to a shipping firm in Bristol that made no sense. They were recorded as losses, but the corresponding manifests were missing. It felt important. "I am merely organizing His Grace's correspondence, my lady. I do not play the simpleton with me." Lady Honoria snapped. "I know your father's history. An aptitude for numbers clearly runs in the blood. As it would seem, does a tendency to preside over financial ruin. The cut was deep, and it was meant to be." Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced her hand to remain steady on the page. She would not give this woman the satisfaction of her tears. Before she could formulate a response, the Duke himself appeared in the doorway. Alexander Tristan Everett, the 6th Duke of Ravenshaw, was a man carved from the same stone as his cold, cliff-top home. Grief had hollowed him, leaving behind an unnerving stillness. His face, which might once have been handsome, was now a mask of stern composure. He was tall and broad-shouldered, but he moved with a quietness that seemed to absorb the sound around him. He looked from his aunt to Clara, his dark eyes, unreadable. He noticed the tension in the room instantly. He noticed the way Clara's shoulders were set, a defensive line against his aunt's presence. He noticed the faint tremor in the hand she rested on the open book, a book he had never asked her to open. He had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both badly.
Aunt Honoria,
He said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of warmth, but possessing an authority that made his aunt turn eye. Was not aware you were expected. Came out of concern. Alexander? She replied, her tone shifting to one of martyred affection. A concern for you. Concern for poor Arthur. The house feels like a tomb, and you leave its affairs in the hands of a servant. She flicked a dismissive glance at Clara. Clara began to rise, intending to melt from the room, as she was expected to do. But the Duca's voice stopped her. Miss Ashton remains at my request, he said. It was not a defense, merely a statement of fact, but in the cold economy of Ravenshaw, it was more than Clara had ever received. Lady Honoria's eyes narrowed. Very well, then she may as well stay and hear it. She is, after all, part of the problem. She drew a folded legal document from her reticule and placed it on the desk, with a soft, definitive slap. It landed beside the ledger, the crisp white paper a stark contrast to the worn, ink-stained pages. A.F. petitioned the courts. Alexander for guardianship of Arthur. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the sea fog, colder than the stone walls. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. She looked at the Duke, expecting an eruption, a ducal command that would banish his aunt from the house forever. But Everett simply stood there, his face pale, his composure cracking for the first time since his wife's funeral. He looked not at his aunt, but at the document, as if it were a death sentence. And in a way, it was on what grounds? He asked, his voice strained. On the grounds of neglect. Lady Honoria's voice rose, filled with a righteousness that had been waiting years for this moment. This estate is insolvent. You cannot provide for the boy. You have hidden yourself away, leaving him in the care of a paid companion, while his inheritance turns to dust. He does not speak. He does not laugh. He is a ghost in his own home. I loved his mother, your late wife, and I will not stand by and watch you destroy her only child with your grief and mismanagement. The court will see that I am right. They will give him to me, to be raised in a proper home. A warm home, Each word was a hammer blow against the fragile peace of the house. Clara watched the Duca's jaw tighten, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He looked trapped, cornered in his own study. For all his rank and power, in that moment he looked as lost as his son. His aunt, seeing her advantage, pressed on. You have until the hearing, 1 month. Prove to the magistrate that Ravenshaw is solvent. Prove that you are a fit father. You cannot. We both know you cannot. She gave Clara one last triumphant look. You see, girl? This is what happens when one reaches above one's station. The entire house comes crashing down. With that, she swept from the room, leaving the document on the desk like a declaration of war. For a long time, the Duke did not move. He stared at the paper, his breathing shallow. Clara remained by the desk, a silent witness to his unraveling. The ticking of the mantel clock was unnaturally loud, each second marking the approach of a disaster. She should have left. A true servant would have made herself invisible. But she stayed. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough. Leave me. Clara hesitated. She looked from his rigid back to the ledger on the desk, the book filled with the secrets that could either save him or condemn him. The numbers she had been wrestling with for weeks suddenly held the weight of a child's future. She did not leave. Instead, she took a steadying breath, the cold air filling her lungs and clearing her head. All her life, she had been told to be quiet, to be useful, to be invisible. But her father, for all his faults, had taught her one thing: numbers do not lie, and the truth, however complex, has a strength of its own. Your Grace," she said, her voice low but clear in the ringing silence. He did not turn. The situation is not what your aunt believes it to be." He gave a short, bitter laugh. Is it not? The estate is in ruins. My son will be taken from me. It seems quite clear from where I am standing." No," she said, a new firmness in her tone. It surprised even her. The books are not lost. They are merely disordered. I can make them speak the truth, Your Grace." She took a step closer. But I will need access to everything, unquestioned. Every bill, every letter, every account book. Your father and his father kept. And I will need time, free from other duties." She paused, gathering her courage for the final, most important condition. And you will have to trust me." This, at last, made him turn. He looked at her, truly looked at her, as if for the first time he saw not just the quiet, useful governess, but the daughter of his disgraced steward, a young woman with ink on her fingers and an astonishing fire in her eyes. He saw the very same stubborn intelligence that had, in her father, led to ruin, but in her, it was tempered with something else. A stillness, a quiet integrity. He had been alone in his grief for so long, surrounded by servants who feared him and relatives who judged him. He had no allies, no one to trust. And here was this overlooked woman, the one person in the world with reason to resent him, and his name, offering not pity but a plan. "You believe you can untangle this mess?" he asked, a sliver of disbelief in his voice. "I believe the truth is in these pages," Clara said, her hand resting on the heavy ledger, "and I know how to read it. The debts are real, but I do not believe they are the whole story. Let me find the rest of it." It was a preposterous bargain. To place the fate of his son, his title, his entire world, into the hands of this young woman, with nothing to her name but a disgraced father and a sharp mind, the world, his aunt, his solicitor, society itself, would call him a fool. He was a duke. He commanded armies of men, of tenants, of servants. Yet he was being brought to his knees by columns of ink and a woman who had, until this moment, been little more than a shadow in his home. He walked to the desk and picked up the custody petition. He read it again, his expression grim. Then he looked at Clara, his gaze intense, searching. He was a man drowning, and she had just pointed to a distant, almost invisible shore. It was a mad hope, but it was the only hope he had. Very well, Miss Ashton," he said, his voice quiet but decisive. You have your conditions. The household, the archives, the accounts, they are all yours. Find the truth." He let out a long breath, the first he seemed to have taken since his aunt's arrival. Find it, and you will have saved more than just this estate." He did not say what, but Clara knew. He meant his son. He meant himself, and so, without a contract, without a promise of reward, Clara Ashton began her work. The study became her domain. Dust sheets were thrown over the furniture in the lesser-used parlors as housemaids were redirected to help her hauling. Dusty deed boxes from the attics and forgotten account books from damp cellars. The house, which had been sinking into a stupor of grief, began to stir with a new, quiet purpose. Clara worked with a feverish intensity. She lived in a world of numbers, her days and nights a blur of ink and paper. She created a new set of master ledgers, her clear script cutting through the chaos of generations of neglect. She found extravagances from the fourth Duke, foolish investments from the fifth, and then, in her own father's time, a series of catastrophic loans taken against failing crops. The debt was real. It was a mountain. But as she worked, a strange pattern began to emerge. Small discrepancies, payments that were recorded twice, income from tenant farms that was undervalued. It was not a grand conspiracy, but a slow, creeping rot of mismanagement, of despair, of a steward who had lost his way, and a duke too consumed by his own history to notice. Everett kept his word. He remained distant. He would walk past the study late at night and see the single candle burning, see her silhouette bent over the great desk. He saw the meals left untouched on a tray outside her door. He saw the exhaustion in her face when she emerged to take her daily walk on the cliff path, the only respite she allowed herself. One evening, he found her asleep, her head pillowed on a ledger, her hands still loosely holding a pen. A half-empty cup of cold tea sat beside her. The fire had died down to embers, and the room was chilled. He stood watching her for a long moment. In sleep, the careful composure she wore like armor had fallen away. She looked young and terribly vulnerable. He resisted the urge to touch her, to smooth the stray wisp of hair that had fallen across her cheek. Instead, he quietly fetched a heavy wool shawl from a nearby chair and draped it over her shoulders. It was a small, inadequate gesture, but it felt like the only thing he could do. He rekindled the fire, his movements silent and practiced, before retreating back into the shadows of his house. When Clara awoke an hour later, stiff and disoriented, the first thing she noticed was the warmth. The fire was blazing, and the heavy shawl was wrapped around her. She touched the unfamiliar wool, her heart giving a strange, unfamiliar flutter. She knew, without knowing how, that it had been him. Her work was not confined to the ledgers. She was still Arthur's governess, and the boy was a puzzle far more complex than any financial account. He lived in a world of silence, his large dark eyes so, like his father essay, watching everything but revealing nothing. The staff whispered that he hadn't spoken a full sentence since his mother's death a year ago. They said he was stubborn, or simple, or broken. Clara did not believe any of it. She saw a child buckling under a weight he could not name. She did not press him to speak. She simply made space for him. She read to him, not childish stories, but tales of adventure, of explorers and ancient kings. She sat with him in the neglected conservatory where his mother had once grown orchids, and simply watched the rain lash against the glass. The staff had been told by the late Duchess that Arthur's singing had tired her during her illness. A careless word from a frustrated nurse, overheard by a small boy, had become a terrible truth in his mind. He believed his own voice, his own joy, had harmed his mother, and so he had locked it away, as if it were a poison. Clara learned this not from the staff, but from a small tear-stained book of hymns she found tucked beneath his mattress. One hymn was marked, its page worn thin. It was a simple evening lullaby. One afternoon, as a storm raged outside, she sat with him in the nursery, the room lit only by the shifting, watery light from the window. She began to hum the tune, very softly. Arthur, who had been staring blankly at the wall, went utterly still, his head turned towards her, his eyes wide. He did not speak, but he leaned forward, just an inch, listening. Clara continued to hum, her voice quiet and steady against the drumming of the rain. When she finished, the silence returned, but it was different. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. A few days later, Clara was in the study, wrestling with the payments to the Bristol shipping firm. They were the final piece of the puzzle that refused to fit. Arthur padded into the room, a rare event. He stood beside her desk watching her. "And it is difficult work," she said, not looking at him, keeping her tone light. He pointed a small finger at the column of figures. "A bad numbers," he whispered. His voice was a tiny, rusty thing. Clara's heart stopped. She turned to him slowly. What did you say, Arthur?" Mama cried about the bad numbers," he said, a little louder this time. She told Papa they were eating the house." He looked at the ledger with a deep, childish hatred. She died because of them. And there it was. The heart of his silence. A childos, terrible, simple logic. He blamed the ledgers, the debts, the endless, anxious talk of money that had filled the house in his mother's final months. His silence was not just grief. It was a protest against the thing he believed had killed her. "Oh, Arthur," Clara said, her voice thick with a feeling she could not name. She knelt down in front of him. The numbers are not bad. They are just as sad and confused. Like us. But they did not hurt your mother. Her heart was just tired. It had nothing to do with this. She pointed to a different ledger, one she had started herself. See? I am telling them to be cheerful again. He looked at her, his brow furrowed, wanting to believe. He reached out a small hand and touched the back of her ink-stained one. It was a fleeting, feather-light touch, but it felt like an anchor in a storm. That evening, the Duke sought her out. He found her on the terrace, staring out at the turbulent sea. "Arthur spoke today," he said, his voice raw. "He told a footman that you were making the numbers cheerful. What does that mean?" Clara told him everything. About the hymn, about the Boyas confession, about the terrible burden he had been carrying. Everett listened, his face a mask of anguish. "I did not know," he whispered. "I was so lost in my own grief, I did not see his." He looked at Clara, and for the first time the mask of the Duke was gone. She saw only a man, devastated and profoundly lonely. Everyone I hired before you tried to force him to speak. They tried to jolly him out of his sadness. You just sat with him in it a grief, needs a witness. Your Grace, she said softly, and not a cure. A comfortable silence fell between them, the first of its kind. They stood side by side, two lonely people on a cliff, watching the storm clouds gather. It was in these quiet, stolen moments that the foundations of the house began to shift. The cold stone of Ravenshaw was slowly, imperceptibly, being warmed by her presence. Intimacy grew, not in grand declarations, but in shared silence, in a mutual glance across a dinner table, in the simple profound fact that she stayed. The Duke found himself altering his routines. He would take his tea in the study, ostensibly to review papers, but really just to be in the same room where she worked. He asked her questions, not just about the accounts, but about the books she was reading, about her walks on the cliffs. He was a man, waking from a long, cold sleep, and she was the first warmth he had felt. But the world and its cold logic had not gone away. One afternoon, his solicitor, Mr. Albright, arrived from London. He was a small, anxious man who seemed permanently hunched against a coming storm. They were closeted in the Duke's private office. Clara, working in the adjoining study, could hear their raised voices. It is not enough, Your Grace. Miss Ashton's work is remarkable, a miracle, but the debts are still substantial. Lady Honoraus' counsel will paint a picture of ruin. The magistrate will not risk a childless future on the promise of slow recovery. You need a more definitive solution. And what do you propose? A veteran's voice was dangerously low. A marriage, Albright said, his voice pleading. A Lady Carmadia's daughter, Eleanor, a substantial dowry. It would wipe the slate clean overnight. It would silence all questions of your financial stability. It is the only sensible move. There was a long pause. Clara held her breath, her pen frozen above the page. The thought of another woman coming to Ravenshaw, of this fragile, budding warmth being extinguished, was a pain so sharp it stole her breath. Then the Duke spoke. His voice distant, thoughtful. He was not speaking to Albright anymore. He was speaking to the cold, hard facts of his world. A wife with a fortune, he mused. Yes. That is what the world understands. He sighed, a sound of immense weariness. And what of Miss Ashton? The question hung in the air. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. A Miss Ashton is a governess, Albright said, his tone dismissive, a very capable one it seems. But in this matter, she has nothing to offer. She has nothing to offer. The words, spoken by the solicitor, but not contradicted by the Duke, landed like stones in the quiet of Clara's heart. Of course, it was the truth. She was a woman with no name, no fortune, no connections. She had her mind, her integrity, and her ink-stained hands. In the calculus of the world, that equaled nothing. All her work, all the sleepless nights, all the small victories with Arthur, they were just services rendered. They were not an offering, they were a governess's duties. She felt a familiar, cold shame wash over her. She had allowed herself to hope. She had mistaken the Duca's desperation for respect, his loneliness for a nascent affection. She had been a fool. She did not hear the Duca's reply. She quietly stood, gathered the shawl he had given her, folded it neatly, and placed it on the chair. Then she walked back to her room, the solicitora's words echoing in her mind. She has nothing to offer. From that moment, a subtle chill returned between them. Clara became quieter, more efficient, her composure a flawless, impenetrable shield. She finished her work on the ledgers. The mystery of the Bristol shipping firm was the final key. With the help of a clerk Albright had grudgingly hired for her in the city, she had uncovered the truth. The payments were not for losses. They were for shares. The late Duchess, a woman with a keen mind for business that her husband had never fully appreciated, had been secretly investing in a new kind of steam engine for cargo ships. She had used her own pin money, routing the payments through a trusted intermediary to avoid her husband's notice, fearing he would see it as a gamble. The investments, left untended for a year, had matured. They had more than matured, they had blossomed. Ravenshaw was not just solvent, it was wealthy. She presented her findings to the Duke and Albright in the study. She laid out the new ledgers, the documents from Bristol, the letters from his late wife's man of business. She explained it all with a calm, clear precision that left no room for doubt. Albright was speechless, his mouth agape. He kept looking from the papers to Clara as if she had performed some kind of alchemy. The Duke said nothing. He simply stared at the documents bearing his late wife's familiar handwriting. He was seeing a woman he thought he had known, and realizing he had not known her at all, and he was seeing the woman who had uncovered it all. A woman he had allowed his own solicitor to dismiss as having a nothing to offer. The shame of it was a physical weight in his chest. Clara, he began, his voice thick. Your Grace will now have no trouble at the hearing, she said, her voice cool and formal, cutting him off. I am glad to have been of service. She turned to leave a wait, he commanded. But she did not. For the first time she walked away. When he had asked her to stay, the day of the hearing arrived. Gray and cold, Ravenshaw felt like it was holding its breath. They traveled to the county town in a tense, suffocating silence. Clara sat beside Arthur, holding his small, cold hand, while the Duke stared out the window, a storm of unspoken words raging between them. The courtroom was an imposing, wood-paneled chamber, smelling of dust and old law. The magistrate, Sir John, was a stern-faced man, with eyes that seemed to see everything. Lady Honoria was already there, seated beside her smirking barrister, looking for all the world like a queen holding court. Her barrister opened, painting a vivid picture of a crumbling dynasty, a grieving, neglectful father, and a silent, haunted child. He spoke of unpaid bills, of a reclusive duke, of a house in mourning and disarray. It was a compelling, damning portrait. Then Albright stood. He was a different man. He was armed with Clara's ledgers, with her truth. He began to speak, his voice gaining confidence with every word. He presented the evidence of the estate's solvency, culminating in the revelation of the late Duchess's investments. He laid out the documents for the magistrate to see. A murmur went through the room. Lady Honoria's face had gone pale, her confident smirk replaced by a look of disbelief. Her barrister, flustered, tried to object, to question the document's authenticity. These papers have been prepared by a mere governess, he blustered. The daughter of a man known for his financial irregularities. How can we trust them? Sir John looked over his spectacles at Albright. Who is this person who prepared the accounts? Miss Clara Ashton, my lord, Albright said. With your permission, I would call her. Clara felt a wave of nausea. All eyes in the room turned to her. She walked to the witness box, her legs unsteady, her heart pounding. She felt small and plain in her simple gray dress, a sparrow among peacocks. Lady Honoria's barrister began his cross-examination, his questions dripping with condescension. He brought up her father, he questioned her motives. He tried to paint her as an ambitious schemer, worming her way into the Duke's confidence. Is it not true, Miss Ashton," he sneered, "that you have taken advantage of a grieving man to elevate your own position?" To Clara met his gaze, her own quiet and steady. "I have done the work His Grace required of me." "Ah, the work? Or have you been playing the Duchess in a house, with no master?" An angry murmur came from the Duke's side of the room. Before Albright could eject, Everett himself stood up. His voice, when he spoke, cut through the tense atmosphere like a blade. That is enough." The entire room fell silent. The Duke, who had been a study in rigid control, now radiated a cold, lethal fury. He took a step forward. "A Miss Ashton," he said, his voice ringing with an authority no one dared question. "A has worked day and night to save my son's inheritance. A task for which I and I alone am responsible, and in which I failed. She has shown more integrity and honor than anyone in this room. She endured my grief, my neglect, and the insults of my own family, and she did it to protect my son. She is not a schemer. She is the woman who held this house together when I let it fall apart. Her name is Clara Ashton, and she is the most honest person I have ever had the privilege to know." He was not looking at the magistrate or his aunt. He was looking at Clara, and in his eyes, she saw everything he had been unable to say: the apology, the respect, the raw, aching truth. The barrister, stunned into silence, sat down. The magistrate looked from the Duke to Clara, his expression thoughtful. He cleared his throat. "The financial questions appear to be resolved, Your Grace. However, the matter of the Gilda's well-being remains." He turned his kind, weary eyes to Arthur, who was sitting small and silent between two worlds. "Arthur, my boy," he said gently, "I know this is difficult, but can you tell me, where do you wish to live?" This was the moment. The entire case hung on the words of a silent boy. Lady Honoria leaned forward, a predatory hope in her eyes. Arthur looked at his aunt, then at his father. His lip trembled. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. Clara's heart broke for him. She caught his eye and gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. A nod that said, "It is all right. Whatever you say is the right thing." Then, she did something no one expected. She spoke to the magistrate, her voice low, but carrying in the stillness. My lord," she said, "a childless heart is not a legal matter. It cannot be ruled upon. Arthur has been carrying a grief too heavy for his shoulders. He believes his mother's death was tied to the worries of this house. He needs to know that he is not to blame. He needs time and patience, not a new home." She looked directly at Arthur, her gaze full of a fierce, protective love. "Arthur, no one blames you for being sad, and no one ever would blame you for being happy again." Arthur looked at her. Then he looked at his father, who was watching him with an expression of naked love and fear. He slid off his chair and walked, his small shoes making no sound on the polished floor. Not to his aunt, not to his father, but to the magistrate's bench. He stood before the great desk, a tiny figure of immense gravity. He looked up at Sir John and spoke, his voice, clear and true, ringing through the silent courtroom. "I want to stay with Papa," he said. He then turned and pointed a small definitive finger at Clara, and with Clara, "She makes the house warmer." It was over. Lady Honoria slumped in her chair, defeated not by law but by the simple, undeniable truth spoken by a child. The magistrate smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "I believe that settles the matter," he said. That night, Ravenshaw was transformed. Fires blazed in every hearth. The staff, buzzing with the news, moved with a new lightness. It felt as if the entire house had exhaled a breath it had been holding for a year. Clara, however, felt a quiet ache. Her work was done. The Duke and his son were safe. There was no longer a reason for her to be there. She went to her small room and began to pack her few belongings into a worn valise. She would leave in the morning, before the Duke was awake. It was the proper thing to do. A knock came at her door. It was him. He stood in the doorway, no longer the remote Duke, but just Everett. He saw the open valise on her bed. A look of sharp pain crossed his face. What are you doing?" he asked, his voice hoarse. My work here is finished." "Your Grace," she said, not looking at him. It is time for me to go." No." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. The small space was suddenly charged, alive with everything unsaid. Your work is not finished." He walked over to her, stopping just before her. Clara," he said, his voice low and intense. Look at me." She slowly raised her eyes to his. The cold mask was gone completely, replaced by a vulnerability that mirrored her own. "I heard what Albright said that day," he confessed, his voice thick with shame. She has nothing to offer, and I said nothing." It was the single most cowardly and unforgivable moment of my life. Because, even then, I knew it was a lie. You had already offered everything. You offered your mind, your time, your heart. You walked into my frozen life, and you made the house warm. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she held them back. You were desperate. Your Grace. I was useful. I was desperate. He agreed. I agreed. But that is not what this is. I have been a fool, Clara. A blind, grieving fool. I have been so afraid of feeling anything since she died, so afraid of loss, that I almost lost the one thing that could make me whole again. He reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it, over the faint ink stains. Do not go," he whispered. Stay. Not as a governess, not as a clerk. Stay as my wife, as my partner, as the Duchess of Ravenshaw, as the heart of this house, which you already are. She pulled her hand back, the old wounds, the old beliefs about herself, rising up. Do not say that if it is only gratitude," she said, her voice shaking. "I will not be a debt that you feel you must repay." Ah. He stepped closer, his eyes burning into hers. A gratitude is a payment, a debt discharged. This is not a debt, Clara. He gently cupped her face in his hands. This is a prayer that you will stay, a prayer that you will teach me how to live again. I love you, not for what you did for this estate, but for who you are, for the quiet strength that would not break, for the kindness that you showed my son, for the truth you were not afraid to speak. And then he kissed her. It was not a practiced, polished kiss. It was clumsy and desperate and honest. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and sorrow and a fierce, dawning hope. In his arms, Clara finally let go of the belief that she was merely useful. She let go of the idea that she had nothing to offer. She was not a solution to a problem. She was chosen. She was wanted. She was home. She kissed him back, pouring all the unspoken feelings of the past months into that single, profound touch. Months later, spring had come to the cliffs of Ravenshaw. The gorse was ablaze with yellow flowers, and the sea, once a turbulent gray, was a sparkling, hopeful blue. Laughter, a sound long forgotten, now echoed in the halls. It was Arthura's laughter, chasing a puppy across the manicured lawns. Inside, the great house was filled with light and air. The heavy velvet curtains had been replaced with lighter fabrics that fluttered in the sea breeze. Fresh flowers stood in vases in every room. In the main hall, the portrait of the late Duchess still hung in its place of honor. Beneath it, a vase held a simple spray of wild orchids, the kind she had loved. Her memory was not erased. It was tended with love and respect. Clara, now the Duchess of Ravenshaw, walked through the gardens, her arm linked with her bondes. There were no more ink stains on her fingers. Everett stopped and turned her to face him, his eyes full of a quiet, steady love that was now as much a part of him as his title. He was no longer a man carved from stone. He was a man warmed from the inside out. As evening fell, they stood in the nursery, watching Arthur sleep. The setting sun cast a golden glow across his peaceful face. Clara leaned down and smoothed his hair back from his forehead. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He smiled a sleepy, contented smile. "A good night," he murmured. He paused, and then with the simple, profound certainty of a child, he added the word that remade her world. "A good night, Mama." Clara's breath caught. Tears filled her eyes, but these were not tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of a joy so complete it felt like sunlight filling her veins. Evrata's hand found hers, his grip warm and strong. She had come to Ravenshaw with nothing but a disgraced name and a mind for numbers. She had expected to be a shadow, a useful ghost in a cold house, but she had stayed. Through the cold, through the judgment, through the grief, she had simply and quietly stayed, and in staying, she had done more than save an estate. She had built a family. She had become the woman who stayed, and in doing so, she had finally, truly, found her home.